Our chosen reading this morning will be from the book of Genesis and 11th chapter, verses 6 through 9. Now, Genesis 11, verses 6 through 9. And the Lord said, "Indeed, the people are one, and they all have one language. And this is what they begin to do. So nothing that they purpose to do will be upheld with them. Come, let us go down there and confuse their language, that they may not understand one another's speech." So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth, and they ceased building the city. Therefore its name is called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of all the earth.
Good morning, church. It's good to see everyone this morning. We have an absolutely fantastic crowd, especially with the thought that we've got so many traveling. I know that my girls are traveling, and we'll be back here this afternoon. And the Hildenbrands and the Coons also are traveling, so we want to continue to keep all of them in prayer, as well as others that might be doing so as well. But it's good to see all those who are here. All those who are watching online as well. It is good to have all of you with us this morning. I want to put a little bit of a plug in for this afternoon. I know that the activity at the Beehive kind of came up on us, and it was just an opportunity that was given to us, kind of a little bit short notice by a few weeks. But I hope that you're considering going to that. I know that there are some that already have some plans and aren't able to make it, and that's fine. We're going to try to set up some different days of the week and some different opportunities where we can go to places like the Beehive and the Waters and help out either with their worship or just go there and visit and spend some time in fellowship with them. But I hope that you'll consider coming to that and just going and spending time with those people and playing board games with them for 2 hours. So we're going to be there from 2 to 4. If you think that you can make it or you would like to come talk to me afterwards. That way I can have a little bit better idea of number that we'll have. I think this will be a great opportunity if you have kids as well for them to interact with folks at this facility. And I'm sure it'll be a lot of fun. We went caroling there around Christmas time, and it was a fun group of people, and they really appreciated us being there. So I hope that you will come and participate in that, if you will. I've probably done enough badgering up here after basketball games and victory, so I'm not going to do that this morning. But I know it's getting to the nitty-gritty in our basketball seasons. Go IU. It was a good game last night. But anyways, once again, no matter who you root for, I'm glad you're here. Okay, glad you're here this morning, and glad that we can learn and worship God together. We've been doing a series on first in the Bible, or beginnings, and we're going to continue to do that this morning. So if you will, turn in your Bibles to Genesis chapter 11. Once again, the way in which we're going to do this lesson, we're going to primarily stay within Genesis chapter 11, and we're going to look at some scriptures and discuss those scriptures as we move along through here. So Genesis chapter 11 is where we're going to be. And obviously we're going to be talking about the first time that mankind dispersed throughout the earth. Namely, we're going to be talking about the story of Babel. But first, I want to talk about ants. Ants are one of the most fascinating creatures that exist in the world today. And I think most of us would agree with that. We know that one of the really cool things about them is that ants themselves can carry 10 to 50 times their weight on their back. Now, I want to I want to know what kind of energy drink they're drinking or something like that, because that's pretty awesome that they're built in such a way that they can carry that much. And of course, we see them carry like little bits of nuts and stuff like that, large leaves that are 5 times as big as they are. It's just amazing what they can do as far as carrying grains and nuts and stuff like that to their home in order to feed their particular colony. They also are known for building amazing tunnel systems underneath the ground. One of my favorite things as a child was when my mom and dad bought me an ant farm. You know, when you get an ant farm, it comes in this very thin thing that has 2 panes of, mine was plastic on either side, but maybe yours was glass on either side. And then you would put the sand or the dirt down inside of it, and then you would put the ants in there, and then you would give them food. And you would watch them over a period of hours or a period of days build these elaborate tunnel systems where they would store their food. Well, it gets a whole lot more elaborate whenever you think about what they're able to do underneath the ground, and they're able to create chambers that protects their queen. And their system of work is just absolutely fascinating and absolutely amazing. And the thing about these ants is the reason why they're able to do that is because they do everything in this systematic unity. Like, they all know what their job is, and nobody fights over that job. They know what their particular role is in their colony, and they carry out that role. But here's something else that I find very fascinating about ants. That is that they are very easily confused and dispersed. As a matter of fact, if you're walking along a sidewalk and you see this Congo line, as it were, of ants going back and forth to a food source and going back, one of the things that I guess you could say is kind of mean to ants, but it's a little bit fun too, is you can take an object like a leaf or a rock, and you can put it in the middle of their line, and you can see the ones that are in the back of the line, they start going, oh boy, what happened? What happened? Where'd the line go? Where are we supposed to go? And eventually they'll figure it out, and they'll start another line around that object, but for the next couple of minutes, it's just funny to watch them kind of just scatter and disperse, and they don't know what happened. They don't know what is going on. So there's all this confusion that is happening. And that's why I feel like whenever we look at the story we're about to, humans are a whole lot like ants. You know, whenever we are thrown off our rhythm, or whenever a wrench is kind of thrown into something that we're supposed to do, or a work that we do together, sometimes it drives us crazy. Sometimes it makes us disperse. Sometimes whenever we obviously have big disagreements, and I think this is a natural thing for humans, we go our separate ways, don't we? And so we kind of see that mirrored in the ant world. But this morning I want to talk about a story in Genesis chapter 11 that takes place about 100 years after the flood. And this story begins in Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 and 2. Here, Moses tells us, now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. So what we see in Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 and 2, is that while we are about 100 years out of the flood, we think about the descendants of Noah and his wife, and then Ham, Shem, and Japheth and their wives. And of course, they have been repopulating the earth. They've been being fruitful and multiplying. So the population of the earth is booming. It is growing. But what we can kind of see at this point is that everybody is still kind of together in the same region. It's kind of one big happy family that are all still around one another. And so you even think about Ham, and this would have been after the time that Ham and his descendants had a curse put upon them, and they were kind of looked as the outcast somewhat. They still were together with the rest of the family at this point. And so I want to take a look at this story on what happened and why is the story of the Tower of Babel there? What happened in that story? What was the purpose? What was it trying to show us? And first of all, what I want us to understand about this is we just read verses 1 and 2. We understand that at this time that the people in existence following the flood were one. They were one. They were unified. They were together. We know, according to verse 1, that they had one language. They had one language. And we know that Noah's descendants stayed in one area for a good amount of time. How do we know this? How do we really know the timeline on this? Well, whenever you go to Genesis chapter 10 and verse 25, you might be thinking, why do we skip over Genesis chapter 10? Genesis chapter 10 is a whole bunch of names and lineages. Okay? It's just telling us how long so-and-so lived before they had sons, and then other sons and daughters, and then they died after this amount of time. So it gives us the generations, especially the generations leading up to Abraham. Well, in Genesis chapter 10 and verse 25, whenever we look at that particular part of the lineage, there's something interesting that is put into this text. Take a look at it with me. It says, to Eber were born two sons. The name of the one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided. And his brother's name was Joktan. All right, so the name Peleg has some significance there with this idea of being divided, of division. That's exactly what the name Peleg means, is division. So we know that in the years that Peleg was alive, that is when the earth was divided. And so now we skip on over to Genesis chapter 11 to understand the timeline context of our story and understand what the world was like in the time of Peleg. Now, when we think about the fact that they had one language, scholars and others have always been very curious on what was that language and what must that language have sounded like. Well, I'm going to tell you what, this is an assumption, but this is an assumption that I actually agree with, and that is that whenever we think of what was the original language, that language would have been exactly or similar to the Hebrew language, because the Hebrew language was the language of God. So we can actually probably conclude that God spoke to Adam and Eve in the Hebrew tongue. So that was a language that was at one time being spoken by and being used by all of mankind. And so that's kind of neat to think about how that language, at least in form, still is spoken and still exists today. Yet think about all the hundreds of other languages that now exist. You think about, even as we're talking about a language that will eventually be divided in our story, they went from one language to several, but even those languages began to change and disperse, and there became even more. How many Latin languages are there? Well, there's 3 or 4 at least? Let's see, you got You've got Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, which are all considered of the Latin tongue. All right. You've got Germanic languages like German. English is actually a Germanic language. All right. So you have even more languages today than you had when there was a division that took place at this time. But at this point in our story, they were all together. They all spoke the same tongue. And something else that was a great contribution here, the fact that they all had one language helped with this, that they were all alike in their thinking, okay? I think that's an important thing that we kind of overlook, especially when we're teaching the story of the Tower of Babel with children. We really focus on the aspect of all of them having the same language. But in Genesis chapter 11 and verse 1, according to the ESV translation, it says they had the same language and they had the same words. Whenever you look at the Greek there, not the Greek, the Hebrew there, that points more to the fact that the same words means that they were alike in the things that they thought. That they were on the same page, in other words, in what they wanted to do and what they wanted to accomplish. We know this, that because of that they were creative in innovation. Oh, didn't mean to go too far there. They were creative in their innovation. Take a look at Genesis chapter 11 and verse 3. In verse 3 it says, "And they said to one another, 'Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly.' And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar." And so, as they gathered together and as they traveled to the land of Shinar from the east, they all did this together in unison. And as they were in this valley, they said, let's build places to stay. Let's build settlements. And of course, I believe that this is helping us to see some of their innovation. Because normally, especially at this time in the history of man, most people would settle in places where there was either a lot of rocks, a lot of stone, for which you could build stone structures with, or they would build in places with vast and thick forests where they could build homes, where they could build shelters out of wood. Well, when they went into this valley, they didn't have a whole lot of that. And so they learned how to make bricks from the clay of the ground. This bitumen was not necessarily the normal way in which they would even fasten rocks together and use it as mortar. And so that's something else that they basically came up with at the time in order to build all of these structures. So they were all one, and they were all like-minded in what they wanted to accomplish at that time. Now, as they were building these structures, they had decided to go even further. They said, let's build a city. Let's build a city and a tower. They built this city and tower. Genesis 11 and verse 4. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top to the heavens. And let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth." It's kind of interesting as we look at this verse. It's very important for us to know and understand what was the thought and the intent of mankind here. Because we could look at it in one context and we could say, oh, well, everybody who is like-minded, all of God's people, all of God's creation, they just want to stay together. And then they wanted to build a tower. Why did they want to build that tower? Because they wanted to reach heaven. And we could look at that in one context and we could think, those are pretty good aspirations, right? We want to be closer to God. So we're going to build this city and we're going to build this tower where we're all like-minded and we're all one. But I think we do need to think about these reasons. 2 reasons why they built the city and the tower at Shinar. They wanted to stay together. Number 2 is very important for us to consider. What else did they want to do? They wanted to make a name for themselves. They wanted to make a name for themselves. What does that mean? Let's make a name for ourselves lest we get dispersed, lest we get scattered. I think it's important for us to think about what our attitudes are like whenever we want to make a name for ourselves. Whenever we want to show great might and great power and great strength and have that reputation among everyone. Which it's kind of interesting here. I would say that in many ways this would suggest to us that there were in fact some other settlements and other populations out there, but nothing quite as big, nothing quite as huge as this. A majority of the earth was together at this time. They wanted to make a name for themselves. But I think the greater context here is they wanted to make a great name for themselves before God. And I think we can kind of see that as we look on in this particular story. But as I think about these 2 things, 2 reasons why they built at Shinar, to stay together and to make a name for themselves, it reminds me, and I don't have it up on the screen, I don't have a slide for it per se, but you've got an article in the front of your bulletin. You might want to show me with a show of your hands. How many of you have ever been to New Harmony, Indiana? Okay. I've been there a lot. I've been going there since I was a kid. Our school used to take field trips there because it's a pretty neat place to show how they used to cultivate the land and how they used to do things in pioneer days. And I remember going there one time and they showed how they used to bake bread over a flame and over a fire or by a wood stove. That's some of the best bread I've ever tasted. It's pretty awesome. But whenever you dive deep into the origins and the original story of the city of New Harmony, it's very interesting. If you didn't know, New Harmony was originally established and built to be a utopia. Now, what is a utopia? It's a civilization that separates itself from all other civilization. A civilization that's going to have particular requirements in order to live there. And if you don't want to abide by those requirements, or if you don't fit the criteria, you cannot be there. And it's interesting because it was actually a utopia twice. It started out in the real early 1800s, and I believe it was 1814, if I'm not mistaken. Started out as a religious utopia. Some individuals did not like how their particular faith was being run, and so they broke off from that faith, and they started their own. They also didn't like what was going on in other faiths around. So yeah, they started their own within that town after buying 20,000 acres. That's a lot of land, isn't it? Well, that lasted a little under 10 years, and they decided to sell the property, and they moved back to Pennsylvania. Well, they sold the property to a Mr. Owen. And his dream and his idea was to create a socialist utopia where everybody in this town were going to be the same. They were going to share everything. They were going to farm together. And what he did was he recruited biologists. He recruited geologists, people that were scientific in their view of the land. And they learned how to cultivate. They learned how to mutate different seeds. And the rules and the ideas there were to keep everybody of the same mind and to share in all things. Well, after 2 years, that utopia fell. It didn't work. It was a social experiment that ended up failing because you could not get every single person to think exactly alike. In some ways, I think that there's a connection here to how the nature of man changed a little bit after the Tower of Babel. Because we're not all going to think exactly alike in the same way unless, obviously, we can be grounded in something like the Bible that shows us exactly how we need to live. Still, we're not going to agree on things like color of carpet and stuff like that. There's always going to be something that causes a little bit of division. But in each of these situations, there was hubris. Meaning, in these utopian landscapes, people lacked humility. And when I think about what was the lack of humility within the people of the city of Babel, it was because they thought that they could reach God by building a tower. That they thought they could be on an equal level with Him. When we think about even here in Indiana with the utopian society there in New Harmony, those people thought that they could live almost perfect lives just by separating themselves from the world. But here's the problem, was whenever you get a whole bunch of human beings inside a utopia, what happens? We fall to our human nature, don't we? The human nature to do what we want to do. And obviously all that comes from sin. So that's just not going to work. If you're out there to make heaven on earth ain't going to happen. And I think that's what God was trying to show in the story. Let's see what God does as He's observing these people and what they're doing. God took action. He didn't just sit around and let them do whatever they wanted. It's interesting. God took some action. I want us to read on this. He noticed their hubris. He noticed their lack of humility. He noticed that they were trying to get away from the idea of being lower than God and looking up to God and serving Him. And they were working on ways trying to be equal with God in some ways, to reach Him up in heaven. Well, Genesis 11 and verse 6 said this, "And the Lord said, Behold, they are one people, and they have all one language. And this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them." I think it was this reference by God, and obviously God appears to be talking to Himself. We understand that the Father is speaking to the Son and the Holy Spirit all at the same time. Just as we see in Genesis chapter 1, let us make man in our image. Kind of the same idea there. He says, mankind is doing all of this stuff, and eventually what are they not going to be able to do? We might look at that and we might say, well, God was worried about humans. God was worried that they could actually take that kind of power. I don't necessarily think that's what's happening here. I think what's happening is God is understanding, God knows that if human beings get a big head, then they're going to forget about God. They're going to forget about Him. They're going to lose their desire and their need for God. And so there were times, not just in this instance, there were times throughout man's existence where God had to, and still today has to remind mankind that everything is in operation because of Him. Remember, those people wanted to make a name for themselves. They wanted to put themselves on a pedestal equal with God. God says something needs to be done here. So what does He do? Well, we get to the plot of the story. We get to what happens. We get to the whole reason why we have this story in the Bible. And that is that God changed their language. And what did God know would happen if He did that? Mass confusion. People would find people that were like them, and then they would go their own ways with those particular individuals. Well, let's take a look at verses 7 and 8. Genesis 11, 7 and 8. Here, God speaking again says, "Come, let us go down. Let us go down there and confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech." So the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Now, geographically speaking, it's kind of interesting because most geographers have estimated that the Tower of Babel actually was being built or existed at one time unfinished, where eventually the city of Babylon was built. And when the great empire of Babylon was there, and as that empire was building, they had structures called zaggurats. And those zaggurats were actually temples of theirs that had these high upper rooms that symbolized being close to their gods. So it's interesting how that principle kind of carried on into those who would settle in the land later on, or maybe those who would continue to settle in that land. But we understand that the Tower of Babel itself was left unfinished. It wasn't finished because all those who were of like mind, all of those who were working together at that time, didn't understand each other. So whenever they would find people that they could communicate with and who spoke the same language, they didn't have enough people to finish that tower. Well, this is confusing. It's frustrating. Let's get out of here. And let me tell you, whenever you're suddenly put in a situation where you don't understand anybody, it is quite frustrating. I will never forget an exercise that one of my missions teachers at Fried Hardeman taught us one time. It was a special missions class. He was a missionary for a long time in Romania. He's been a part of the Bible department down there now for several years. But he says, I'm going to show you what it's like to go into another country and try to communicate something in particular. So he gave us a piece of paper that had a bunch of dots on it. It's kind of like a connect the dots paper. And then we had a cheat sheet. We had some connect the dots that had already been done. He said, I want you to do the connect the dots the same way that you see it on this paper. But then you know what he did? He handed us all these little looking glasses, these little mirrors. He says, you have to do the same thing on your blank sheet that you see on the other sheet through the mirror. So whenever you looked at that mirror, everything was different. Everything was opposite. And so why you think, you just do the opposite of what you think. No, whenever your brain is trying to go back and forth with that, all of a sudden, you're confused. You're kind of weirded out, and you get frustrated. And I wasn't very good at it. I think I was able to do 2 or 3 dots before the exercise was over because I was just like, what's going on here? That was to show the frustration and how hard it is for people that come from different cultures and languages to work together. And so that's kind of what God had created. Now I think it is a great test, though, for us today. I don't think God's intent was that for all time, for us to not be able to communicate with each other, therefore we can't spread the gospel to all the world. No. We obviously have our abilities to learn learn those other languages. But we do that through some frustrating situations. So that created a greater test for us. But when mankind gets up on a pedestal, whenever we think we have it all figured out, God most certainly humbles all of us. And I think that ought to be the lesson this morning. We need to make sure that as children of God, that we learn humility. What does that mean for the Christian? What does that look like? It means that as Christians, yes, we can look and we can say, I'm so thankful and so proud that I have Jesus Christ. I'm so proud to be a Christian. I think it's okay for us to be glad that we are children of God. But also we can get into that attitude to say, well, since I have God, since I have Jesus, I'm better than this person. Or I'm better than that person. Well, guess what? God created all of us the same, a little lower than the angels. We're all there. We're all in the same spot. And every single one of us needs the blood of Jesus Christ just as much as the next person. And so whenever we have this idea of hubris, whenever we think we're above, we need to remember what God did to the people at the Tower of Babel whenever they had that attitude. And we need to remember we need to remember scriptures like 1 Peter 5 and verse 6. Well, we're reminded, humble yourselves therefore under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time He may exalt you. Now think about the language that's being used in 1 Peter 5, 6. Humble yourselves, how? Under the mighty hand of God. Not equal with the mighty hand of God, because that wouldn't be humility. Humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God. Stay under God. Stay under His authority. Take God's authority seriously in your life. Let Him do the leading in your life. Don't tell God, hey God, I like your ideas and all, but come with me. I've got some good ones. Yeah, He'll laugh at that. Because His ways are so much higher than our ways. If we do that, if we live a life of humility, we'll be lifted up with God one day. We'll be raised with Him. But we need to have that patience. And now, live a life of humility to God. With that, I want to offer a song of invitation. And at this time of invitation, we offer these invitations, we offer the opportunity to come forward as an opportunity and as an act of humility. Sin is embarrassing sometimes. Well, it ought to be embarrassing all the time, right? Sin is embarrassing. Sin is humiliating, especially whenever we realize that we're caught knee-deep in it. Whenever we realize that Satan has a hold on us and that we've allowed ourselves to be separated from God. It takes humility to come and to admit that. And it takes humility to say, I've got to get back to Him. I've got to make a change. That's why we offer this time of invitation. For you to come and allow us to pray with you and for you, to seek the forgiveness of sin whenever we know that we have fallen. If we're a Christian, we always have the open invitation in order to do that. However, there might be some here this morning that are not yet Christians. Sometimes it's maybe for a lack of knowledge that we don't think we know enough. Sometimes we might think, well, I don't think I need Jesus yet. I'm a pretty good person. I'm living my life. Folks, if we haven't submitted ourselves to Jesus, if we haven't given our lives to Him, if we haven't come to Him in repentance, understanding that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and if we haven't given our lives to Him in baptism and allowed Jesus to wash our sins away, then we're nothing. And it's only Jesus that can make us something. And that can happen this morning. The waters of baptism are ready. We're ready to make that happen for you if you're ready to become a child of God this morning. Would you do that? If you need to come this morning for either reason I just mentioned, I ask you to come now as we together stand and as we sing.